Okay, so this sets us up really well for what I'm going to talk about today. In case we haven't met, I'm Alexis Palmer. I'm also a faculty in the Department of Linguistics at CU Boulder. One of the questions you might be asking after hearing about Arapaho is, well, first of all, why did we pick this language for UMR? That's a question I don't have the answer to. But also, when working with a new language, when we want to build a UMR collection for a new language, do we really need to start from scratch, right? Do we need to start from nothing and try to come up with everything on our own? In this talk, I want to talk about two different efforts that we've done to try to say, no, we don't have to start from scratch. As you've seen, as you can imagine, UMR annotation is difficult, especially if we don't have existing role sets or existing frame files. Some too much of the content of a UMR graph might be available in other kinds of linguistic data. And how much of that content and what it is depends on both the sentence and the data resource that we have to work with. Our approach, essentially, in both of these projects is to generate partial UMR graphs from the resources that we already have for the language that we want to work on. We can then use these partial graphs as sort of skeletons to speed up annotation. Then the annotator, instead of building the entire graph from scratch, has two roles. First, to verify or correct the automatically generated graph, and second, to fill in what's missing so that we have a complete graph. Because of course, we can't get everything in the UMR from probably any of our existing resources. Okay, so in our quick 30 minutes, myself and then Federica will talk about two projects. The first is that I'm going to talk about is about bootstrapping from language documentation resources, where we have maybe some common conventions from one language to another, but no strict set of conventions. We can't rely on one particular format for any of these resources. Federica will talk about her work bootstrapping from universal dependency data, where we do have a mostly common format. Okay, so when we talk about resources from language documentation, we might mean a number of different things. In our work with Arapaho, we have a traditional lexicon, probably a bilingual lexicon, a reference grammar, the expertise of a linguist who knows the language, in other words, Andy, and a collection of interlinearized gloss texts, or IGT. So a lot of my research over the years has been working with or trying to automatically produce IGT. Just as maybe a refresher, or in case IGT is new to you, this is a standard representation used in linguistics, in grammars and linguistics papers and so on, and it's also a very rich source of information about a language. We have a multi-line representation. This is the interlinearized part. These representations, we might have different numbers of tiers or lines conveying different information. At a minimum, we should have the original transcribed text. Maybe this would be instead of morphological segmentation. Ideally, we have both so that we can analyze the changes that happen from the canonical form to the surface form. We need to have a gloss line that is generally a combination of stem translations into some language of wider communication and labels that indicate grammatical function or meaning contributions, like the future label and the agreement kind of morphology. In the Arapaho data, we also have some part of speech labels. Sometimes these might be folded into the gloss line. Again, there's no standard set of conventions. And then we have a free translation into some language of wider communication. So this is the resource that we're trying to work with. The idea being that if we already have this IGT, first of all, this means someone has done a lot of work to analyze this data and to build this representation. And a lot of what's in here also goes into the UMR graph. So we don't want to do that work twice. Right? We don't want to ask the linguist or the annotator to do this a second time when we already have this analysis. So this is a paper that we published at LREC last year. I forgot to mention Matt Buchholz and Benet Post Matt just finished his master's at CU Boulder, and Vinay is one of my PhD students in linguistics. And we worked also with Julia and Andy on this project. So the first thing that we tried to automate is frame file generation, to see if we could kind of bootstrap a set of role sets from the resources that we have. Just a reminder of a role set, it gives us sort of a template for typical argument structures for verbs, and should also list morphosyntactic aliases. So here's the approach we took for trying to build these frame files automatically. First, we identified some sort of seed verb classes. Then we looked to role sets in a higher resource language, in this case English, which are semantically similar to the seed classes. And I'll show an example of these in a moment. Then we do some verification of the fit to make sure the English role sets we've selected actually work for the Arapaho verb stems, and then collect aliases for those role sets. So this is the set of seed verb classes that Andy came up with. We have 6 different categories of verbs, things like give type, transfer verbs, hit type volitional verbs. And for each of these classes, I think we have about 5 or 6 different Arapaho verb stems that are members of that class. The idea being that these are high-frequency verb types that we expect to have some parallel in the English role sets.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, you are going to explain why it is a continuous form, the first one, and the others are all infinitive?
That I'm not going to explain.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah. But you could ask Andy about that, I guess. The simple weather verbs are interesting because they really are realized differently cross-linguistically. Right? The example I have here, I had to cut this down a lot because I don't have a lot of time. But the example that we'll look at is the give type transfer verbs. So we have, for example, an Arapaho stem, bin, which means something like give something to someone. And we look into, we have an expectation, right, that for this verb class, we should have an agent, a patient, and a recipient. Both VerbNet and PropBank are large collections of English role sets. So if we look into the Unified Verb Index, we look for the role sets we have for give. For most of these verbs, we'll have multiple senses available. So we look for the sense and the role set that matches the expectation for the Arapaho verb class. So we get this role set that gives us an agent, a theme, and a patient. And the idea is we simply take this as a proxy for the Arapaho verb. It's not an approach that will get us role sets for all of the verb stems, but for actually a fairly large percentage. So in our verification step, we sampled some sentences from our corpus with verbs from these classes. I think we took 6 verbs for each class and 10 sentences for each of those verbs, around that number, and checked whether the English role sets actually cover the cases that we have in the corpus, in the data. 12 verbs from 6 classes, yeah. What we found is that 95% of the time, the role sets cover the argument structure that we need. So we feel like this is a pretty good proxy, right? This gives us a reasonably good predicate argument structure for a high percentage of the verbs in our corpus. This doesn't mean they're correct all the time, and we certainly need to do some adjustments. Okay, that's what I have to say about the frame file generation. Next, I want to talk about how we do the partial graph generation. And there is a paper with a lot more detail. I'm sorry that I'm flying through this, but I'm also happy to talk about it in the breaks or this afternoon. I still have some office hour slots. So with the graph generation, as I already mentioned, we want to avoid this duplicative work or duplicating effort. There's a lot of overlap between annotating IGTs and annotating UMRs. And so we developed a system that lets us capture most of a graph for many of the sentences. The general approach here is to look into the IGT and define some sort of mapping between the IGT elements and the components of the UMR graph. So we start by identifying in our corpus, in our particular data set, which gloss labels refer to verbs. right? So for Arapaho, we have VTA, VTI, VIA, and VII. For other languages, you'd have some other set of labels that the particular linguist or language worker who built the corpus chose to designate verbs. There's no standard set of labels. This is something we have to determine on a language-by-language basis. Then we identify a set of gloss labels which might be used in the IGT to mark event participants. From there, we need to define some sort of heuristic mapping from those participants to predicate roles. Right? So mapping individual participants marked in the IGT to the roles in the role set. And then we wrote a bunch of scripts to parse the IGT and apply these heuristics. So as I mentioned, I forgot I had the slide, these are the set of verb labels we expect in the Arapaho IGT. We got these from working with the linguist. We could also do this by cross-referencing between the grammar and the IGT corpus. So in this IGT example, we have a VTA label. We can trace this up because IGT should be aligned at the morpheme level. So we can trace this up and say, okay, bean is our verb stem. And then we have this inflectional marker, which is likely to indicate participants. Right? This is a pronominal affix that indicates both subject and object. So this should tell us that we have a third singular subject and a second singular object. And we can then populate the role set with those properties of the participant. In some cases, we can also take a strategy for assigning explicit nouns to participant roles. For example, in our particular data set, nouns are marked as NA or NI, so animate nouns are inanimate nouns. If we have a VTA, we know that this verb should have an animate object. So we can take the guess that the noun marked as NA may be likely to be the object of that verb. So it's a lot of guessing that we use. We define some rules that we hope will be right much of the time, and then apply these to the data that we have. So we have, in this example, we have our verb stem. We know that it's transitive with an inanimate object. We have an inflectional marker here. We have an inanimate noun marked here. So we take the part of speech labels from these two lines, the inflectional label from the line above, the actual lexical content, and we need to come up with some way to map all of these things into the role set. This is the basic idea of the approach. In our first version of the system, we really just focused on the core predicate argument structure, with the idea being that if we have that as a skeleton, adding the other pieces of the graph should be much less work. Here's an example of the human annotated graph for one Arapaho sentence and what we produce with our system. So the things highlighted in yellow are the pieces that we captured. You see that we have different argument roles, subject and object instead of actor and undergoer, but we get a good portion of the graph correct. We don't get aspect, we don't get modal strength, for example. So we did an evaluation of a sample of graphs, partial graphs that we generated from our texts. We looked at 3 different criteria. We did this over 100, or we selected 100 sentences. 2 of them were bad for reasons I don't remember, so the evaluation is over 98 sentences. 100% of the time in this sample, we got the right head verb. We didn't restrict, I don't think we restricted the sentences in terms of structure or length. We did find we don't deal well with complex sentences yet. We looked at whether the subject and object pronominal affixes are correctly represented in the graph. We got 78 out of 98 of those correct. And we also asked, when we have overt nouns, do they get linked correctly to the head verb? Here we didn't do quite as well. 35 overt nouns. We have 35 overt nouns. 26 of them were graphed correctly. So about 74%. This is the more challenging task in this evaluation. So this was the state of things last year. We really focused on the predicate argument structures, but there's a lot of additional information in the IGT that we can map pretty cleanly to UMR structures or substructures. Here's another example that shows some of these other attributes. For example, we have a negation label that we can at least preliminarily map to a negative polarity attribute in the UMR graph. Whether we attach it in the right place is another question. That's something, the particular scope of the polarity attribute might need to be modified by the annotator. But we can identify that there is negative polarity in this sentence in some way. We also have an affix that is marked as an intensifier. So we can add a degree attribute to the graph. And we have a particular prefix that lets us, the ability to do something that lets us derive an aspect, a potential aspect value of state, that this is a stative predication. Again, these are all best guesses. It's a first pass annotation, but it saves a lot of annotator time. So far, we've done this just with Arapaho, but the general principles of IGT to UMR are applicable to any language with reasonably clean IGT data. Here's one example from Quechua, which is another of the languages we're doing UMR annotation for in Boulder, where we see, a different style of IGT. Here we have just the 3 lines. Again, from the negation marker, we add some polarity information. And then from the gloss of mother, we can add this kinship relationship. So we haven't done this for Quechua yet. We're actually starting work on our second case study, which is a language called Cotorilla, which is, our linguist there is Chris Stenzel, who many of you have at least emailed with, if not met. So we're working with Chris to see how well the system can work for Cotorilla. The goal in doing this generalization is to create a system that is transparent enough for someone who doesn't have a lot of computational expertise to use for a new language. The idea being that this should be configurable and allow the linguist to kind of encode these mappings from the IGT elements to the UMR graph components. We're not trying to train a parser that will take a sentence and give us the UMR, but rather a system that lets a linguist define these mappings, because they're very idiosyncratic per language, based on also the choices made by the person who developed the IGT. So for example, our configurable system might ask the user, how is negation marked in this data set? The user can then specify, we look for the affix neg in the gloss line. And that should attach to verbs. So that's the information that the linguist might specify. So then our system can look for that particular label in that particular tier of the IGT, and based on that, generate this negative polarity attribute, not negative polarity, but polarity attribute with a negative value, and attach that node to the corresponding root word in the graph. So that's the idea of this system. We have a fairly complicated system for Arapaho, and we're still working on making this more generable.
So
Yeah.
so it is a rule-based approach, as I understand.
Yes.
So how many cases, how many IGT you tried for getting a kind of respectable UMR for
Yeah.
that language?
So for Arapaho, we've applied our system to all of the data in our corpus. I think it's about 5,000 sentences. Is that right? And we're using those now as a basis for the UMR annotation in Arapaho. We did our initial tests and evaluation with about 100 sentences.
So you did not really sit and think initially that, okay, these are the different types and phenomena that exist in this language. Because how did you, so this 5,000 was a coincidence. You started with 5,000?
It's a rough number. Really, we started with Andy, right? So in defining these rules and these heuristics, we spent a lot of time talking together as a group about what things should be retrievable from the IGT, what things we should target, and what those mapping rules would look like. We did a lot of iteration on, generating graphs, finding errors, fixing the
How much
rules
time
and
did
so on.
that take, if I can ask?
At least a few months of regular meetings. Yeah. So we'll see now with our new language what the,
So for example, most of the Indian languages, I'm from India.
yeah,
So most of the Indian languages except for Hindi does not have a respectable parser
mm,
and does not have good enough corpus. You train a parser.
Yeah.
But IGT may be a good idea.
yeah. I think it's such a rich source of linguistic information that is underutilized, personal opinion. So I need to finish up so I can hand things over to Federica. This is just a bit about if we can generate these role sets automatically, we can then use those to adjust the participant labels and the argument structure that we get in our generated graphs. When we generate the graphs, we just use things like subject, object, and oblique as sort of placeholders. If we have this initial frame file, then we can replace these with more specific labels like actor and undergoer. Okay. Yeah, so basically in the system we have now, it's a type-based system that lets the user specify these mappings. It then generates these partial graphs automatically, and the user can add new rules and trigger regeneration of graphs for the same data set. That's the basic platform we have. Okay, so I will skip the conclusions and turn things over to Federica to talk about her work, which involves a similar approach, but applied to a different starting data representation.